So our foreign policy needs to be based on a philosophy of what's good for the world, and let's do that which is good for the world. If we had taken these steps, I think we would have been able to deal with terrorism much better than what we are doing now with the war that we have declared on terrorism. Because in this war, we are killing more innocent people than terrorists. And for every innocent person that is killed in war, in violence, we are giving rise to at least 100 other terrorists against us. So we are not putting an end to terrorism. And that has now come to be true when the government is so afraid of printing the report on international terrorism. For the last few years, at least ever since 9/11, the government made it a point to print the report every year on international terrorism to show us how international terrorism has subsided because of the war against terrorism that we are fighting. But this year, they have found that international terrorism has increased substantially. And it belies the fact that we have put an end to international terrorism by the war there. And so the administration has decided they are not going to print the report at all and not publicize it. Now this is an indication that our whole policy of violence and war against terrorism was wrong. So we need to be more understanding and think more of alternative ways of dealing with this. And the only alternative way that I can think about, and which has been proved very substantially to be a good way of dealing with conflicts, is nonviolence. However, we have to understand what we mean by nonviolence. I have found in my travels around this country and even around the world that people have a very limited understanding of the philosophy of nonviolence. They only understand it in terms of no violence or anti-war. But I want to prove to you tonight that nonviolence is much more than that. And that all of us, each one of us, even though we don't fight and even though we are against all kinds of violence, that we are still contributing to violence in society. And I learned this from grandfather. And you know, grandfather himself had no spatial influence that made him go towards the philosophy of nonviolence. He was, as he says in his autobiography, a very simple person from a very simple family that had no special inclinations towards nonviolence. But he says on reflection that the first lesson that he learned on nonviolence came from his wife, my grandmother. And this happened at the age of 13. In those days, it was very common for people to get married at the age of 13 in India. And they were both 13 years old when they got married. And grandfather says that at that age, he didn't know what the role of a husband should be, who should lay down the rules and who should enforce the rules. And so he started going to the library and reading books on the subject. And obviously those books were written by male chauvinists because all of them talked about how the husband should lay down the rules and enforce the rules strictly. And so after reading this book, grandfather came home that evening and he told grandmother, said, "From today you are not going to step out of the house without my permission. I want no arguments about it. This is the law and you got to obey it." And grandmother didn't say anything. She didn't retort, she didn't react to this statement. She just quietly went to bed. Got up the next day and she continued to do whatever she was doing always, continued to go out and visit and all that, and never bothered to get grandfather's permission. And a few days later, grandfather realized that she was not obeying him, and so he confronted her again and he said, "How dare you disobey me?" And that's when grandmother very quietly, without reacting, without getting angry, she asked him, she said, "I was brought up to believe that we must always obey the elders in the house. And I believe the elders in this house are your parents. Now if you're trying to tell me that I should not obey your mother, but obey you instead, let me know so that I can go and tell your mother I'm not going to obey you." And of course grandfather couldn't tell her to do that, and so the whole matter was settled without anybody hurting and fighting over it. And grandfather says that that was the first and the most profound lesson in non-violence that he learned. And it's a fact. We have been told by experts today that anger is what motivates almost 80% of the violence that we experience, either in our personal lives or in the lives of our nation. That anger is something that causes violence among us. So it's very important that we learn about how to deal with anger. Grandfather realized this several years later when at the age of 24 he went to South Africa. And there within a week of his arrival in that country he became a victim of prejudices, and he was beaten up and thrown off the train because of the color of his skin. And he was angry. And at first he wanted to retort in anger. But he remembered grandmother's way of dealing with that situation, and he said, "No, I'm not going to give in to anger." And he sat on the platform all night wondering how to get justice. And by the next morning it dawned on him that non-violence is the only way he can make the people understand that this is wrong, that prejudices are wrong. He said punishing them is not going to help make them understand that. It's only reforming them, changing them through self-suffering that will bring about that transformation. And that's how the birth of the philosophy of non-violence took place. And he practiced it for 22 years in South Africa, very successfully. So that is what we need to understand about the philosophy of non-violence. That it's a very powerful and a very deep-rooted philosophy. Not something that is just anti-violence or anti-war. I learned this lesson about anger from grandfather when I went to live with him as a young boy at the age of 12, because I was beaten up in South Africa. And I wanted eye for an eye justice, like anybody else did. And grandfather taught me, he said, anger is like electricity. It's just as powerful and just as useful as electricity is, but only if we use it intelligently. But it can be just as powerful and just as deadly if we abuse it.